our plan is to talk about co-teaching in the content areas in the classroom and what those co-teaching practices look like for us as special education teachers, but also for regular education or general education teachers. So our idea is today that we're going to share with you some models of that, and so we're going to allow you to participate. What we're going to be asking you to do as we work through these models is if you've printed off your structured notes page, you have 3 questions that will frame what you were asking you to do while you watch the model of those videos. And the one is that you're going to look at what instructional strategies do you see occurring while we're talking about the instruction. The second thing is what is the general education teacher doing? And then the third thing is, what is the role of the special educator? So we're going to just take a look and give you some practice opportunity of that around that. And so we're going to begin with math, then we're going to look at that in reading, and then we're going to have an example for social studies. So we have one for elementary, middle, and high school grades. On the screen you'll see right now we're talking about co-teaching, and so these are the most familiar. We hear these and we talk about these co-teaching approaches. And so I'm just going to briefly talk about that. We have team teaching, and team teaching is when you have 2 teachers together. You'll see a representation of that today. We'll have parallel teaching. You'll also see an example of that today. You'll see station teaching, and that's where you have stations and each teacher is leading a station. And then we'll have alternative teaching example. And then we'll have one more that's one teach, one observe. The most frequently used and recommended by the research is parallel teaching, and that's when 2 teachers are teaching the same content, but they're delivering that content in 2 different ways. The station teaching is when that you have a teacher, a regular ed teacher, a special education teacher, both are leading a station and they're leading that instruction. And then you have an independent station. We think about that when we think about Mr. John O'Connor, who wrote Good Instruction, Great Achievement, because what he says is if you have 2 people in that classroom, both of those people should be responsible for leading and delivering instruction while they're in there. And so that's the good thing, is we think about how do we use co-teaching and how do we have co-teaching be effective in our classrooms. And it requires some planning, some organizing, and putting things together. But we hope that today you'll get to see some examples of each of those. So that's our plan for today. The next thing I'm going to ask you to do is we have, if you've got your structured notes page printed out, we're going to look at this next thing right here. So we're going to ask you, as we're transitioning, let's talk about what the roles and responsibilities are of co-teachers. So we're going to ask you to look through this list and look at the responsibility, and you decide, mark it on your structured notes page or just mark it on a post-it note if you have. But let's talk about what is the role of the general ed teacher, what is the role of the special education teacher, what opportunities are there shared responsibilities, and then what other times would we use paraeducators, volunteers. Let's think about our Save the Children folks. But so look at this list of responsibilities that we have in a classroom, and you decide if you think it's a general ed teacher, a special education teacher, or shared responsibility. And I'll give you 1 minute to look over that list. Okay, I know that maybe you didn't get through all the lists, but let's just look real quickly at the responsibility and roles of the general ed teacher and the special education teacher. So, introducing the partnership to the class. Let's think about that. Would that be a general ed teacher, you think, or would that be a special education teacher responsibility? What do you all think?
General ed.
Okay, it could be a general ed and they're introducing it to the classroom. Absolutely. It could be shared. Absolutely. Absolutely. What about planning the lesson? Who should be planning the lesson?
But shared with both general ed and special ed.
Shared. So shared. Yeah, shared. Okay. So we do think shared because there's some responsibilities. We have to know what our role is as we plan those lessons. How about who identifies the needed accommodations for students? Who shares that information about student accommodations?
Special ed teacher.
Right. So the special ed teacher is going to have that expert knowledge about that. What about, so we have 2 questions, one around accommodations, but then one accommodations specifically for special education students. So that would be something we'd have to, look at that one, because our special ed teachers are the experts on the accommodations and supports for students.
You also have 504 students.
And whose responsibility is for that? And what Dean said is we also have those 504 students that are in those classrooms too. Right, and so that may be the general ed, but that would also be something that they may lean on the special education teacher's expertise to get some information for them. But preparing accommodated materials for all students, but then how about for special ed students?
Be the special ed teacher.
You could be the special ed teacher for that. But how about preparing accommodated materials for all students? Sometimes, as general education teachers, we might not have all the ideas about how to accommodate. So sometimes we have to, that's a great opportunity for a partnership too, because special ed folks know partnerships on they know accommodations. General ed teachers know content, so it makes a great partnership when you have them having that conversation back and forth. And that's what you'll see today as we kind of model these, is that conversation back and forth. Because it doesn't take lots of time to plan lessons, but you do have to have some conversations. Also, we're looking at appropriate curricular modifications as determined by the IEP. Who would be doing that? It could be a special ed teacher, but do general ed teachers have access to IEPs and need to understand?
That's what I was gonna say, you have to access them to IEP so they can see the accommodations and all that as well.
Right, so it could be a shared responsibility. So the special ed teacher is going to make sure that we are getting those curricular modifications, but the general ed teacher is going to have to be responsible for planning those, because the special ed teacher might not be in there all the time, so they need to be aware of those. But they do have access to the IEP. Let's go ahead and, the next one is around differentiation. And who would be responsible for helping with instructional materials and differentiating instruction?
That could actually be shared.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of the shared.
Yeah.
I think that's certainly something.
So I think I agree. And even whole group instruction, that's the next one. Who's responsible for that?
Shared.
Yeah.
It is shared, because if we know what the research says is that more effective instruction occurs when you have two highly qualified professionals sharing responsibility in the delivery of instruction. And you'll see an example of this. If Stephanie models a math lesson and she is the content expert in mathematics and I am not the content expert in mathematics, then I'm going to have to learn what role can I have to serve in that instruction, and how am I going to do that? Because I may have to learn some of that. I may have to go in there and learn some of that. I may have to learn how to do a skill or a strategy so I can share it with students, so I could lead a small group. And I may have to talk to Stephanie about that, or I may have to get some more information on that, because my expertise is not in mathematics. But that doesn't mean that I can't provide supports for students. I have to learn and adapt to that. So, but whole group instruction can be a shared responsibility. We're talking about instruction through station teaching, parallel teaching, and that one kind of gives you a cheat sheet on that, because it is a shared responsibility, right? It's going to take more than one person to be able to do those things. The other one is, looking at grading student work, looking at student work for special education. Those are responsibilities. Regular ed and special education teachers need to know what's happening with student performance and their targets and assessments and formative assessment. But special ed teachers have to know about student classroom performance, because they're progress monitoring their student performance, so they have to know that too. So.
It's also good when you go to write that present level to be able to compare to their peers. So it's good to have that information back there. Is how is all students doing in the classroom compared to my student?
Right.
Is it taking him longer? That goes into that extended time too.
That's an excellent point. So how is my student performing in comparison of the other kids in that same grade? Are they significantly below, or what are they requiring? Much more extended time? Are they requiring more intensive intervention or specially designed instruction with strategies? Do they need smaller chunks, more repetition, additional practice time? So we think about all those things, but we have to be talking about that, because if we're not talking about it, we don't know the answer. So those are all important things to think about. So also things about grading, that's important about student work, but conferencing we're talking about with all parents, and then parents with students with disabilities. So special ed teachers are working with teachers in conferences, particularly for students with disabilities, because if we're having a conference or an admissions and release committee meeting or an ARC meeting, we have to be having those conversations, and we have to have a general ed teacher by requirement to participate in those meetings, Therefore, we have to have those conversations with the general ed folks about what's happening. Classroom management is another one, and I'm kind of just skipping through them. And behavior plans. Well, you know, classroom management can be what? What do y'all think? Is that a shared? Is that a
I
particular?
think it's shared.
It's shared.
I think it's
Or
a
it needs
shared
to be
responsibility,
shared.
right? Because, and you'll see that today too. We'll have an example of that because the special education teacher can help support that through, you know, some of the co-teaching strategies about how we're tracking and recording behavior and how we're tracking and following what's happening on a student's behavior plan. So those were just some examples, but the idea is that we think about what the role is for general ed and special education teachers and how that most of those, we have a conversation, would you all agree, that are shared responsibilities, that we all have a something to contribute. So once I heard that we talk about a general ed teacher is the content specialist, but the special education teacher is the learning process specialist. And so when you put both of those together, that's a great force to be able to provide for students. And those students who are in the gap or those intervention kids get some incidental benefit from having that special ed teacher and that regular education teacher. So it really helps all the kids in the class. And you're going to see an example of that today, how we can even use those two people to provide an enrichment for those students who are advanced in that class. So we can use these strategies not just to remediate or catch up those special ed kids who are behind, but we can use these instructional strategies and these practices with co-teaching to really touch more kids more effectively.
Hey guys, I'm Kim Surgeon. I'm the Social Studies Instructional Specialist for KVEC and had the tremendous pleasure now of working with the special education bunch. So real appreciative of that because I think, especially for me with high school, when you start thinking about the different types of teaching styles for high school, I think it's so important that because sometimes we tend to see them in big groups, and we all know that there's some kids out there that can get lost, and we don't want that to happen. So that being said, I'm going to go into a social studies lesson. I'm going to go into a topic that everyone is going to have to do, especially when you look into our social studies standards, the Kentucky Academic Standards for Social Studies, and that issue is suffrage. But before we talk about that, I want to talk about alternative teaching and why I chose that model for this lesson. Like I says here, one teacher leads a large group and then one teacher leads a smaller group. In this case, we're going to flip it, and I'm going to be the one that takes the smaller group, and Denny Paul is going to be the one that takes the larger group. And that's real intentional for me because what I have found, especially when you're looking at just a regular education class, like a high school class, let's say U.S. history, when you're looking at that and you're having those moments where the kids have to do reading, because no other way to put this, there's times, like for instance, in terms of suffrage, those students have not encountered that topic yet, unless they talked about it some, right after the Civil War, talking about black male suffrage. Notice I did not say women. And then, of course, prior to that, when our nation was initially founded and the different state constitutions, most of the time it had this clause that said you had to be a land-owning white male in order to vote. But sometime in the early 1800s, that starts to change to universal male suffrage. So if you were a man in this country, not black, you could vote. So that being said, we need to look at suffrage. And in this case, we're looking at suffrage from 1920, which is women's suffrage. So because of that, because these kids are encountering content that they've not really had before, then it's really important to do some reading, to do some background knowledge, to build that. Or not even background knowledge, just to give them, a context to work from. And that happens a whole lot in U.S. history and world history in high school. So that's why I wanted to model this, to show you guys how to make sure that we don't lose those kids, that they don't get lost in their lack of skill, because we have to know that sometimes those on and off ramps for reading and writing looks very different. But the thing that's the most important is that the thinking is always going to be the same across the board. So you have got to make the information equitable and accessible for everybody. So that being said, that's one reason why I wanted to choose alternate teaching or alternative teaching. You'll see what Denny Paul does within that. We'll talk some more about that in a minute. So the big thing for me is that the groups have to be flexible, because, for instance, I'm not going to let him take the group, because all too often teaching high school, won't even tell the horror stories about that. We're not going to take out the special ed kids and move them to the corner. No, because I'm finding, especially when it comes to reading, for instance, which is the skill that I'm focusing on today, a lot of children need extensions within that, or they need support within that. But then at the same time, for those of us that teach regular education, we know that there are kids in there that are done. They got it, they read it, they know the information, and you know what? We don't want those kids to get stagnant either. So that's going to be the group that I take And when I take them, I'm going to go into some information, I'm going to do some extensions, and we're going to do some deeper thinking. Whereas, Denny Paul, when he works with that group, we're going to say that's going to be maybe 2/3 of the class that he takes, maybe even 3/4, to look at that chunking and to really look at, get into those deeper reading skills, because there's information in this. Like I said a moment ago, this is information these kids have not encountered, or if they have, it's been on a very limited basis. So we've got to really make sure that they're going to have that background so they can go into the inquiries that we're going to do for social studies. So because of that, his role is going to be incredibly important. I'm going to see him, to be honest, I'm going to see him as the specialist in this area. He's the pedagogical specialist. Because, teaching social studies, I've seen this stuff, I'm comfortable, I'm ready to fly with it. But you don't want to, and I have a real appreciation for those kids who may lack some of those skills, because, I lack those in math, and that sometimes I would feel like the class would go off and leave me. I don't want that to happen to another kid. So that being said, he's going to be the professional, so that's why I'm going to give him control of a good chunk of the class. I'm going to pull the rest of them aside, because like it says up here, they can benefit just from a little bit more intensive study. Small group must be pulled within the classroom and for a short time. So you're going to see, this is going to be a pretty long lesson, and then all of a sudden, we're going to go into alternative teaching. So that's really only to, this is to help students and to really address the bigger needs. So I'll have to take for a second so that he can switch my PowerPoints. So if you guys have any questions or comments, pop it in the chat if you want. And also while he does that, I'm going to front load this conversation. Totally cheated, okay? I came over, they're going to be both groups, and we might even move Dion over with them maybe, but they're going to be both groups. So what you're going to do today is, like when you go into a movie, thank you so much, that willing suspension of disbelief, I need you to do that. Make believe they're my regular ed kids with some special ed kids mixed in there. So they're going to do the reading, and then all of a sudden, bam, they're going to be my gifted kids, okay? And they're ready to go for that. All right. So nobody said anything. So just kind of give you guys our social studies, by the way, social studies looks totally different for those of you that may or may not be familiar with that. We now have 2 types of standards. We have inquiry practice, and we have the disciplinary strand standards. Don't have time to talk about that today, so we're going to hustle. We'll talk about it later. So when we talk about this model, I'm going to be modeling these standards. I'm going to employ the reading and writing standards, and you'll see that, and the interdisciplinary literacy practices. Don't have time to really go into my little checklist with those, but usually when I do, as Dion and some folks can tell you, when I hand that checklist to folks, they start checking them off. In a social studies inquiry, you're going to hit almost every one of those 10 interdisciplinary literacy practices that you find in the reading and writing standards. Then we have implementing inquiry and engaging in multiple thinking and engagement strategies, and you guys are going to see that. So as you do the lesson today, what I really want you guys to pay attention to in terms of social studies, just for a second, in the back of your mind, I want you to look for those questions, sources, and tasks. Those sources that we're talking about are primary and secondary. We have both. The questions, you're going to see how we're going to connect to questions, because what I have found, and I'm going to put this little tidbit out there for those of you that teach social studies, keep in mind that we have the questioning component, which is compelling and supporting questions. So you're going to see us interact with the supporting question quite a bit today. And then you're going to see tasks that the students are going to do. This, by the way, is the graphic organizer. Always go back to that. We'll talk about that another day, won't we, Dion? So anyway, here are the standards. Just throwing those up there very quickly. To the left is a primary source the students are going to look at tomorrow. And that is an actual copy of the law from the congressional record of the adoption of the 19th Amendment. So here's my inquiry for today. Our compelling question that you're not going to really hear today, even though I do have it correctly identified on one slide as compelling, it's supposed to say supporting question. But our compelling question for the whole unit is, what can we do about society's problems? Well, one of those problems, because when you're doing that unit, that time period is roughly 1898 to about 1930 in social studies. So I'm telling you that because this happens in 1920. So this is just one of the supporting questions that we would look at. We have 3 sources we're going to be interacting with. That's the Newsella article is the number one you guys are going to see today. And then, of course, some images from American political and social movements. The task that we're going to do a close reading. You're going to see that. A source analysis with the images. We're going to talk about that. And then, of course, the formative task at the end that you will not see, but that's when the students are going to do a writing to respond. We're doing 2 different types of strategies today. Thanks to Anita Archer, thank you so much. I know that, did you see that? I went, Lost it. So anyway, I can remember Rich White Man, but that's about it. But anyway, so we talk about the engagement strategy that we're going to do. We're going to do think, write, paired share, and rewrite. Thanks to Denny Paul, the minute he saw that what we were going to talk about, because he's a social studies teacher too, he knew that this was an engagement strategy that we could do that would be really important. The literacy strategy that we're going to do is one that I do all the time with all the different groups. This is a phenomenal strategy, really K-12, but K-8, K-5 really love it. And it's talk, read, talk, write. That's Nancy Motley, if you guys want to look that up. I've actually included in the social studies material, by the way, if you want to go access all of these materials right now that I'm using, go into the fall conference folder, go into the materials for participants, and you will see I created a social studies folder. So if you guys want to kind of get there for just a second, I'll talk slower. And then we got to start the lesson. Denny Paul laughed. He knows it's not possible. Okay, so our supporting question, not compelling, so forgive me for having that, I'm going to correct it, is how did women fight for the right to vote? So, okay, class, are you guys ready? So we're good, because we all know that if it's good learning, you're aiming to answer a question. I want you guys to remember, concepts are for teachers, questions are for learners. So we're going to talk about, class, today, about, how did women fight for the right to vote? Because they've not always had the right to vote, right? So we're going to start this first, and so I'm going to tell you guys stage one, so I'm going to make believe my students aren't here for just a second. So the class will be placed into groups of about 4 to 5 to look at these images. You guys are going to see these images are primary sources because they are photographs of these protests. So not going to go into that being a primary source at the moment because right now we're building background knowledge. I'm going to be extremely intentional for the next 3 or 4 days if I taught this unit or as I taught this unit. I would spend the next 3 to 4 days being very intentional, bringing in a ton of primary sources because that is an absolute must now within our standards. So class, what I'd like for you guys to do is to look at these images. So you'll probably have to look up here to look at these. So what is happening in these images? So let's open for the whole group.
Protesting.
Protesting, why do you say that?
I see, well, they're just gathering in groups with signs.
Go ahead, I'm sorry. What else do you see happening in the pictures?
I don't really see anybody
I
smiling.
was just going to say.
Don't see anybody smiling. Why do you say that?
Because they all look very serious.
They look very serious, thank you. And go ahead, Tyler, I'm sorry. I talked all over you.
Looks like I got a message to convey.
They have a message to convey, thank you. Why do you say that though?
It just, the signs, the images, is that guy holding the flag or am I on the bottom there?
Yeah.
Well, unfortunately it's kind of fuzzy, but Tyler says yes.
Okay.
So let me ask you guys this. When you look at these 3 pictures, I want you guys to think, besides what they have in common, what is the difference that you see in these 3 pictures?
Is that all women at the top, I think?
That is all women. Yes, it is. So what are you going to, looking at that now, what are you thinking that image is going to be dealing with?
Probably their right to vote.
Their right to vote, absolutely.
The ones about bringing the troops home.
Yes, so what war do you think that is?
Probably were.
That looks like
If you look real close, you can see it. There's that one sign that
It
has
looks
it
like
in there.
Vietnam.
Yeah.
And they look a little militant with their hats.
Oh, don't they do? They do look a little bit militant, absolutely.
The other one may be like a racial.
Civil rights,
justice,
it's civil rights movement, absolutely. So now your students, our students, when they look at these, so let's take this, so what I'm gonna have you guys do as a group now, so the way I'm gonna get them to talk again, so first of all, what we did is we looked at these. I would have gone much deeper. I would have made the students pull in more evidence. So I would have asked you, why did you think it was, a civil rights movement? Why did you think that? Well, what were some of the things you would have said, Tyler? Because you already, noticed that.
I said that most of the citizens are African American, and then their signs as well.
Yeah? What about the way they're dressed? Do people dress like that now?
No.
Yeah.
The styles.
So there's going to be things I'm going to, kind of bring to my attention my students because they're going to be right when they say it. And what they don't realize is that innately they are responding on a historical level, on the inside. But I want them to verbalize that. I'm going to say, why do you say that? So with the women, so you picked up on, so you automatically, you said, now is that all women? So then I would maybe would have challenged you, why didn't you think it was all women? Why were you kind of questioning yourself on there?
Well, just because I guess they were wearing those hats, you can't really see their
Ah,
hair.
yeah, wearing those hats. Yeah, we're not really used to that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and the dresses were kind of long, so you were like, are those dresses or are those,
Right,
you know?
right.
And then with the Vietnam thing, like you said, Denny Paul picked up immediately. They look a little militant because look how he's holding that flag and he's got the hat and that kind of thing. But what I want to ask you guys today, class, is that if you were going to update these images to today, what would you replace these images with? So I'm going to give you 45 seconds to talk to your table partner there. Now we're going to make believe you're in a group of 4 or 5, and tell me what you would replace those with. So go. Somebody volunteer. What would you, let's say we're going to replace the one at the top. We're going to take out the picture of the women that are fighting for their right to vote, and we're going to replace it with a picture of, huh? Oh, abortion rights. So now, okay, now we can get to a little bit of discussion. I would say, now, are you going to be protesting for or against abortion? So see, we don't have to discuss it, okay? We're just going to say that we're going to put that in there, right? Absolutely. So let's take the second one. So I'm sorry, what was your name again?
Brandy.
Brandy. So Tyler and Brandy, you guys tell me what you would replace the civil rights picture with. Now, Zoomland, y'all can jump in.
Could be COVID rights for the vaccination.
Oh my gosh.
That's a good one.
Wow. Now see, not even on my radar. Not even.
You know, another hot topic has been the removal of troops from Afghanistan.
Oh my gosh. And that would be great for the Vietnam picture.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, you could almost replace it exactly. So then other things, so what are other things that, now what were your students, what would be some of the other protests the students would bring in? Maybe Black Lives Matter?
Yeah.
See, I thought I had seen that, written on you. So we'd have that, we would have LGBTQ.
Yeah.
We would have, well, I love it that you brought, I just didn't even think
How
about
about when Trump was president, the immigration at the wall, right?
the immigration
Building
thing.
the wall.
And building the wall. And then like right now, you've got the issue with
Population.
bringing all those people and bringing in all the refugees.
The Haitians,
Yeah, the Haitians, and then you've got the Afghanis and everything. So, I mean, there's all kinds of things that you could be, wow. Now, I'm still looking on the chat, y'all. Just saying, I'm going to keep calling you out. I'm kidding. Please show up. So, I would love to see y'all there. So, step 2, so now I'm going to ask you guys to get out a little piece of paper. I see you guys have some available there. So now, again, I cannot thank Denny Paul and Anita Archer enough for this. So now, based on our discussions, I want to turn to my students and say, then how can we as citizens use our voice to make changes nationally? So 30 seconds, just jot a note to yourself, and you're going to share it out with your team, and then I'm going to ask each table to report one out. So think, how can we as citizens use our voice to make changes nationally? What are ways that we can use our voice to make changes?
Well, I think that we could do things like publications, or write an article, or write a letter to a senator or a representative, or through a vlog or a blog that we represent our opinion and why we think that. Or
Awesome, thank you. Brenda, what did you say? Because I noticed that you started writing immediately.
Social media outlet, use that. A lot of attention.
Yeah, our kids are going to think of that immediately.
Yeah, that's-
Like create a Facebook, page, or in this case, an Insta story, and start publishing that and that kind of thing. Because now they're going more into Instagram, or they may even do a Snapchat campaign or whatever it may be. But these kids are going to think of ways to get that out there in terms of TikTok. Oh my gosh.
There's a lot more people.
Yes, a whole lot more. Absolutely. Tyler, what was one thing that you said?
I was just at online groups, basically what you're saying with TikTok, that's what I wrote. Online groups, online protests, which could affect more people and have more people in the group.
Absolutely. Oh, and we've got some messages, some chats here. Peaceful protest, voting. Thank you, Ashton and Jeremy. Both said voting. Absolutely. And so thinking in terms of that, so now let's look at pair share. So this is the third component of that. So what we did is what I had you guys do before I came to you. That's why I said I shared with your partners. So you guys talked about that in your whole group. And now we're going to go into, now this is where, and I really apologize if this is a little bit confusing, but because we're intermingling these two strategies, and it looks maybe a little bit crazy, but you know what, that's how we roll. So anyway, so that is, we did a whole bunch of talking in this first part, a whole bunch. Because I have found with students across the spectrum, and when I say spectrum, I'm not just talking about students with special needs, I mean every student in my classroom. Talking sometimes, for some of them, is very much a leveling of the playing field, because everybody can talk and everybody can think. So I can get that learning, I can get that interest, that curiosity activated pretty quickly, especially when I use volatile images, okay? And I intentionally used old images because I wanted them to see that what they're seeing, you know, people want to say, oh, things are changing so much. No, things have always been like this. People have always found a way to use their voice, always, since we've been a country. So that being said, now we're going to go into the reading component. So the article that we're using, you guys see the article there, I've got it in your Google folder if you guys want to look at it, but it's called The History of the 19th Amendment. So as we get that started, what I'm going to ask them to, students to do also, oh, here, just awesome sauce. So what I'm going to have them do, oh, she's written on it a whole lot. You guys see the FAIR model? Get that one out there real quick. So what I'm going to have my students do, so I'm going to ask my co-teacher to go up to the FAIR model at this point, and he's going to write this. So I'm going to tell my students as we read today about suffrage and the 19th Amendment, but we're going to focus today on suffrage because I need my students to understand the concept of women's suffrage before we ever start talking about the 19th Amendment. Sometimes teachers want to go straight to the 19th Amendment, tell them who, tell them why, tell them when. Oh, good, I've covered it, I've taught it, let's move on. We're not going to do that. We're going to really connect the concept of suffrage because, especially for instance in the 8th grade history focus, and for those of you that teach elementary, you could do this lesson, but you could do it in terms of African American males and talk about the 15th Amendment. Because the idea of suffrage is complicated. In some countries, you still have very limited suffrage in those countries. So you could even pull in your high school class a modern day example. So Denny Paul's going to write suffrage in the center of this map. I like to use FAIR models. I noticed that you guys, this was totally by accident. None of us really knew the other was using a FAIR model, did they, Dion? Until yesterday. Yeah. And then we were already locked in to what we're going to do, so we said, you know what, that's okay. So I like a FAIR model because I like to build one with my students. You know, I don't, you know, and you saw how, you know, Chastity just did that. I like to do it a little bit longer, okay? So in this case, we're going to write suffrage in the center here. So after we read this first paragraph, and I'm not going to take the time to read that with you guys, but what we're going to do here is this opening paragraph, and I'll just use mine here, that you guys see I have highlighted, okay? This first paragraph right here, we're going to read it together as a group. So we're going to put suffrage, I may even put women's suffrage. We may even take it a step further, but we're going to keep it right there. So we're going to develop a definition as a class. So I'm going to look at you guys. So if we had to create a definition of suffrage, what would it be?
The act of suffering,
Okay.
or suffering from something.
Okay, so we're definitely going to talk about it. It's definitely an act of. I definitely like that. And suffrage and suffering. Now, by the way, notice I had suffering until suffrage at the beginning. Do you guys remember? And I would use this, by the way, tomorrow in class if I did this whole lesson. Have you guys seen? Do you remember that Schoolhouse Rock video? Suffering until suffrage. So I love it that you brought that up. But in this case, it's going to be the act of seeking the right, or the act of pursuing, however you want to use it, whatever, seeking the right to vote. Okay, or the act of, you know, and you could call it, you know, anything that you want to say there to say, I want the right to vote. Now, if I see that we've got a real issue with narrowing down this definition when I bring it out to my students, then I'm going to say, let's go back to the back of your book. Let's go into your glossary, okay? And let's find what that exact definition is. And we're going to put this up here with that. We don't have time to do that right now, so we're going to move on. So what we've got is we've got folks seeking the right to vote, okay? And in this case, we're going to know that it's women. So we're going to go over here to this other part where it says, now, in order to get the characteristics and everything else, what I want you guys to mark out on your FAIR model on the back of your thing is I want you to mark out characteristics. Why? Because this is why I liked this FAIR model. And I'm going to tell my students right off the bat, we're not focusing on characteristics, we're focusing on facts. Okay? So if you want to circle facts or underline that so that you know that that's what we're going to focus on as we read, I would like for you guys to do that. As we talk about examples from the past, and here it says from life, well, what I would like for you guys to put there is from history. So my students, because they have talked about suffrage before, I'm going to look at them, especially in 8th grade. So you guys are my 11th grade class. So I've mentioned a couple of these examples. So I'm going to look at them and I'm going to say, when in the past that we have studied social studies, or that you guys studied social studies, let's say in 5th grade and 8th grade, whenever it was, and I would say, what was a group that you talked about that did not have the right to vote, but got the right to vote? So who would that be? Black males, absolutely. Now, in 5th grade, they would have talked about, and again, we're going to bring that, I'm going to bring that example in, just as I mentioned a moment ago, and I'm going to have Mr. Denny Paul put up there, is universal male suffrage. So in the early 1800s, every man in the United States, if they were white, had the privilege of voting. So we're going to, list those 2 examples from the past. So we've activated the FAIR model now. It's ready to go, okay? Once my students know that we've started this, they know that we're going to continue, that we're going to have primary sources, that we're going to add to this and everything. We're going to build understanding of what suffrage is by using this FAIR model. All right, so we're ready to get into the reading. So class, are you ready? So the first time that we read this, and I'm going to go ahead and tell you guys this, the first time we read through, because I'm going to do a close reading strategy as you see up here, it's going to be the whole class. I'm going to read a good chunk. Denny Paul's going to read a good chunk. We're going to pick a couple of students, because there are kids in your class that like to read out loud. I'm going to be doing a little bit of a popcorn reading. If I decide not to do the popcorn reading, either he or I will split the reading, because I think that'll be really interesting. Because I think there's times in this you want to hear a woman's voice, and there's times in this you want to hear a man's voice. So it's going to be up to you and your co-teacher how you want to do that. And sometimes it's much more comfortable for your kids if we two do it. So that being said, so then the second read that we're going to go through, that's where we're going to address those vocabulary words. We're going to look at the tier 2 and the tier 3. You guys can see, because you can see my highlights probably from a distance, I have identified those. So there's going to be 5 big words that we're going to put up there, and I'm going to take some time to teach those. I don't want to go a long time into that because I really want you guys to see the alternative model. So we're going to front load some of the vocabulary. That vocabulary is going to be lobbied, because I think it's important they understand that, proliferate, reform, cult of true womanhood. That sounds fun. And then, of course, the political identities. But the other one I think that's very important is enfranchisement. Enfranchisement is the very essence of the suffrage movement. So that being said, those are going to be 5 big words. I'm going to take out the cult of true womanhood. But even though that is a concept I think they need to know. But I'm going to take that out. But we're going to focus on those 5 words. So right now, rather than do that, we're going to go straight on to the alternate teaching, okay? So you guys want to hear third reading. Third reading is when I'm going to take my smaller group to the side, those kids who are ready for that extension, those kids that are really ready to go, deeper into a lot of this content, and then Denny Paul is going to take the rest of the class. So at this moment, this is the rest of the class. So you're going to see what it looks like when he does. So we're going to just focus on reading 1, and you guys will see that that's labeled in there, and that's the first. I've given them 4 paragraphs that we're going to focus on for content. And so he's going to do paragraph 1, then I'll come do paragraph 4.
Okay, so when we're talking about alternative teaching as a method, we're going to look at breaking information down. We may use strategies like chunking. We may pre-teach vocabulary. We may reteach some information maybe from the lesson itself. Or we may extend it, or we may assess your understanding by asking some leading questions or asking some questions. But right now what we want to do is we want to do another close read, and we want to identify any words that you might not understand, and then also any questions that you might have to further your comprehension of this particular paragraph. So let's just kind of read through that one more time. Origins of women's suffrage in the U.S., that first passage. And if you're following along in Zoom land, it is in your notes, and it is the first, it's actually the second paragraph down at the bottom of the page. So it starts with origins of women's suffrage in the U.S. So we would be thinking about really chunking the information for the students in the small group. We would be doing this as an alternative method. We would be really focusing on understanding, assessing understanding, and making sure that there were some key words that they knew and that they were able to ask questions about it. So what we'd have you do right now is just read through it, right, and come up with a question or two that you might have about the reading. And I'm going to walk around, look around, and talk around as I see you on task here, and you can ask me any questions you might have. Okay, now that you've had time to read it, I want you to go back and reread it one more time, and I want you to focus on this question. Can you determine from your reading, thinking about maybe a question you might have, can you determine a piece from the reading that will speak to economic or any type of disadvantage or anything that the woman would not have can you focus on what the woman, what is it that the women are not, the rights that don't have? So that's kind of like a compelling question from this group. Okay? So you want to share with the group now? Marvin, did you have a question about any of this reading that you did, or do you have some ideas about what economic rights that women are lacking here?
No, I mean, the question really made me think about was if a woman was married, I understand that they didn't have a right to own or own property.
Mhm.
So if they were married and their husband died, did the next who owned the property? Would they own it then, or would it be like their dads or their brothers? Or
It might go back into some type of estate, or the state would retain the ownership of that property, because women did not have the right to own property. So if their husbands passed away, I would think it would be that.
So
Yeah.
I
So
just wonder why they put married, not just all women in general, because unmarried women, I'm sure, couldn't own property either.
maybe, yeah, that's a really good question too. I think maybe when we read on further in the paragraph, we understand that there's this whole idea about being submissive.
Right.
And do we know what submissive means? Do we really know what? And can you tell me?
Just overly accommodating, just
Okay.
always giving in.
Always giving in, and so the idea of the ideal married woman then was someone that focused on things at where do they focus? Yeah, their focus was at home, and so they weren't thinking about things of the world like politics that we're talking about here, or having the right to do some things, own some things. And so what's some other things that they didn't have based on this reading that you saw? Of course, the right to vote, and that's kind of what we've been focusing on today, right? That's an example of suffrage, right? They did not have the right to vote. They did not have the right to earn money. They did not have the right to even have any economic gain from that money if they did even earn money. But they didn't have the right to earn any money. So they couldn't have really anything. And the focus was that submissive housewife type, motherhood type of image that we have seen portrayed. And it's come right along decade after decade, and women are still having to fight some of these battles. Even if you think about today, you think about if your mom and dad both work, one may make significantly more. Your dad may make significantly more money because traditionally he's been able to matriculate in the business up the corporate ladder, or maybe if he's in education, he gets the administrative job, and the teacher stays the teacher for all the 30 years and makes a lot less money. You see, so the opportunity there has been taken away. So very good, and we'll go back to Kim.
Awesome. Okay, now I'm going to come over. So now I'm going to make believe I got about 4 more kids, at this table, and I came over and I talked to them. So if you guys can see on the screen here, you can see question number 4, or you actually see the 5th dot, but it's from the 4th section. It says, the author titles this section, Progress and Civil Disobedience. Would you use this word, would you use the word progress to title this section after reading it? And then I wanted them to use evidence to support that claim. That question I put down there by itself because I really felt like it was very important for it, because we're going to look at that because this is, like I said, this is like my GT group, or this is maybe is one of my kids that loves history. You don't necessarily have to be GT just to love a subject sometimes and to have all these awesome skills in it, okay? So anybody can show up in this group, anybody. I may have a kid that's relatively a non-reader, but my gosh, they watch every single History Channel documentary, and they know more about suffrage than I do. So that being said, so I'm gonna look at you guys. Would you use the term progress in that title? When you read that, does that look like progress to you?
In this paragraph, if they didn't.
Yeah, that talks about progress and civil
In some
disobedience.
states, they do this.
In some states, but how many states do we have in the Union? Now, at this point, we only had how many? 48, right? We were just contiguous. So that being said, so we didn't have Hawaii and Alaska yet. But, and I really got to check this, I'm pretty sure that there may have, no, actually there's a few territories maybe. But anyway, when you look at this, I got to go confirm this. When you look at that, and we ask the question, so would you say, is that real progress? And so Brandy, do I understand that you're saying to you that's not real progress?
It's some progress, definitely. I wouldn't admit not definitely, it's not complete.
Okay. So,
We still have a lot of women who don't have the right to vote.
okay, because you have a lot of women that don't have, and especially when you look at that list of the ones that they gained, so you or Marvin, either one could kind of yell out about this one. So when you look at that, you've got some states, like you said, that have it. So what are states that you, when you look on that list, that you notice that they don't have it? So see a state that is not listed. Now see what I'm doing there, you guys? I'm bringing in geography, because this group can do that, okay? So I'm taking this a little bit further with them. So what state did you say?
Kentucky.
Oh, Kentucky, hello? Yes. What's another state that you don't see listed that might be close to us?
West Virginia.
Yeah. What, Tennessee's not here. So what trend are you seeing there in terms of that?
Eastern. Like far eastern states.
Yeah, the eastern states and also the southeast. So you're seeing a very, now see, look at that, you guys. That's not till later in the article. Matter of fact, that's not even something they read, but look at this, because this is my GT group. They're already, oh my gosh, the South has a real problem with the suffrage movement. So so I'm giving them a little bit of an extension here. So that being said, then we're going to go in, then I'm going to look at them and say, well, when you guys looked at those pictures earlier, what were some of those First Amendment rights that these women engaged in to get the right to vote? So what did you guys see? So think of the First Amendment, which is the freedom of press, speech, religion, petition, and assembly. So what were some of those rights that you saw there in that one? Assembly, speech,
Protest.
or petition, yes, protest. Good. Now you guys see, I would love to say we have a long time, but we don't. And I know some of you guys are having to go to all kinds of places in terms of, school. So, duties that you have. So that being said, so thank you all so much. Thank you, and thank you, Marvin. So anyway, so why are we going to alternative teaching here? I'll tell you why. Because students have different needs at the different point of the reading, just like I told you guys. The kids, the thinking is the same across the board. Reading and writing may not be, but the thinking is. Just like I said, you're going to come into my group if you are just tremendous prowess and ability within social studies. I'm thinking, you're thinking, and I want you at my table. I want you to sit with these other kids who may have read an entire book on suffrage, but I'm going to put you over here with them. It doesn't matter your reading level, but unless I think that you need to be with Denny Paul, because you do need those reading skills. Okay, but there's going to be times I'll pull you over here because you're going to need that extension. So that being said, another reason why we have students who need to do chunking and redefining, you guys saw Denny Paul, that was seamless. Did you see how he did? He jumped right into there. He got them say, now you ask some questions if you have some questions. And I love it because that's a question, Marvin, that you came out with that not one of us in this room can answer. So guess what? Now we've got to go research it. I don't know what happened to their money. So now I've got to start doing some historical research. Then we have students who need enrichment or extensions, and so that's why we did what we did. Now the last talk that we just did, and you guys saw it, we're going to make believe that we've done it, and you would concede over here that it is, we're going to finish up the FAIR model. So Denny Paul, tell us what you put on there.
Well, suffrage is in the middle. Of course, that's the act. Over here, the definition of seeking the right to vote. And then we just put some characteristics out there, maybe some facts. We went to facts because we marked through characteristics. And so we come up with, in that first paragraph that we read, the 1848 Seneca Falls Conference, where the women came together and had Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott were both there as leaders, women leaders that were kind of getting the masses together a little bit. And one of the things that I noticed about the reading was that they pulled in an African American man, was Frederick Douglass. And we can't think about this perspective without saying, hey, we think how these kind of things parallel one another. The civil rights movement, the disabilities rights movement, the women's right to have more power economically, maybe to be able to vote. And certainly with the right to vote came a little more power, right? And so we want to think about that. And then we have, down here we have examples and non-examples, which I love because that goes right along with what we talked about with Anita Archer this morning. Anytime we have an example, we want to provide a non-example so that there's a clear understanding. We're checking for understanding. So we have over here on this side, we have an example of suffrage with the 15th Amendment. The black man got the right to vote, okay? And then there was universal male suffrage, okay? And so then we just had, for an image, we'd had any suffragette or any woman picture there. We just stick a picture in there of a woman maybe protesting or maybe leading a march or something of that nature. And then the non-examples to go along with the examples here, we would have, of course, you got your landowners, and we may be intentional with this. We may ask you guys to help us get these answers, and to be thinking about this and giving us some response, because we want response up in our classrooms. We want you reading, writing, talking to one another, and talking to the class, and not being afraid to respond in this safe environment. So that kind of completes it. We have men and children here as non-examples of someone seeking the right to vote, and then landowners already had the right to vote in the United States.
So you guys, just to finish up the lesson and to show you how so you guys can see how we brought this all together. So this is their right to complete their FAIR model, and then it take or pre-right actually, and then to go into their right is going to be how did women fight for the right to vote? Because the next day, what we're going to do, and this goes to Denny Paul's rewrite with Anita Archer, is that the next day we're going to start going into the inquiry, and we're going to look at an inquiry, and it's called How Did Women Use Their First Amendment Rights to get the 19th Amendment. I have to read behind Tanner's head. So students will rewrite their supporting question or their question from earlier today when it says, how can you use your voice? So there's all kinds of things that they're going to be using their pre-writes that they've been doing to inform that, that question about how did women get the right to vote. So thank you all so much for enduring and staying with us right till the very end. And we know we're the last one today. And would you know, they put the two biggest talkers at the end. I mean, I don't know. How did that happen?
And I want to thank Kim for indulging me and working with me and bringing me along on this. Certainly, you can see the strategies just come to life there, and you can see it coming to life in a content area. Back to Dion.
The last thing I have, and I know we went a couple minutes over, but if you could please complete the feedback form. Tanner's putting the QR code on the screen, and that's all we need back from you, but we'd love to have some feedback. Again, this is our first hybrid model. Give us some ideas what worked for you, what didn't work for you, how we can improve, and thank you for your time and patience today, and I hope that you've got a toolbox full of strategies to take back tomorrow or Monday morning to your classroom. Thank you for hanging in there with us today, and you all have a good rest of this school year. I'm sure we'll be seeing you again.